think we have 3 more slides left for male reproductive system, and then we'll move on into female. I put out an announcement to the class this morning earlier that we will have a quiz on Wednesday. I guess that's the one on the Montrose book. And then next week we'll have one over the reproductive system. I'm not sure I put that in the announcement right.
Last week you mentioned there might be one with some like electrolyte stuff on it. Is that still happening?
That's the one he canceled.
That's the one
Yeah,
that
that's one we canceled the other day.
Okay.
There will be one on genetics, on the Mendelian genetics, and then there'll be one more on reproductive. The one on genetics will be just one. It's a worksheet that you bring in to me when you take your final. Okay. And please don't forget to bring it in, because I'm not coming back to campus again. Yeah.
Are we also? Is there going to be lab pages for an extra 10 points?
Yeah, you'll turn in the lab pages on the day of the final exam as well. Just like you have the first 2 units, you'll do that the same thing on the 3rd. Okay. So anyway, the male hormones are really pretty straightforward. I want to say that we've kind of already talked about them. This is the slide I think you ought to study right here, because it talks about the different hormones: LH, FSH, testosterone, inhibin, nurse cells, seminiferous tubules. All that stuff is really right here in this one slide. So please pay attention to it. Notice that there's a red arrow over here, which means stimulation, and the blue line with the 2 lines there on the end of it means inhibition, if you're trying to understand that graph there. So testosterone is just like any other steroid hormone. It goes around being bound to a protein like almost all of our hormones do, and much of them is albumin, and some are globulins as well. So 2/3 of it are carried by globulins, 1/3 of them are carried by albumins. Please don't worry about knowing those 2 numbers. Our testosterone has 2 really points that are very important. If you remember the movie we saw last week about the birth, and you remember that at the 4 to 5 week level there was this gene called SRI, that if you were a male and you had a Y chromosome, it fired off for a few days along in there, started secreting testosterone, and that's what made males turn into males. The gonads up until that point were kind of unisexual. They were both male and female. But as of that point, under the influence of the testosterone, they became males. If they didn't have that, they became females, which is the way we've always known. XY is male. The males have an X and a Y chromosome. Women have 2 X's. So anyway, the Müllerian inhibiting factor leads to regression of the Müllerian ducts. Those were the ducts that were present when it was still a neutral sex sort of thing. The early surge in testosterone made it differentiate into a male, and it also it gets the hypothalamus ready to control things like gonadotropin releasing factor, FSH, LH, sexual behavior, sexual drives, all those things that make us crazy. The female reproductive system. Okay, let's start on it. The female reproduction system, just much like the male, it's designed to both produce sex hormones and to produce functional gametes. The gametes are the eggs. Remember, the woman is only going to make 1 a month, whereas the men are making billions every day. The female reproductive system is much more inclusive, however, though, because not only does it start the life, but then it makes a home for the life to develop in, because females in our species carry the children. And they also then feed the children for the first 6 to 9 to 2 years of life with breastfeeding. And that, of course, is why we're called mammals, because we have mammary glands. And we nourish our babies with milk. Females have a lot bigger job in this whole process. What are the organs? I don't think we really even need to talk about this, but basically ovaries, tubes, uterus, vagina, and external genitalia is it. This does not include breasts unless you're counting it as an external genitalia, which is fine. Here's a midline slice of things, and I think I always love these slices because they have things in it that you just don't think really are much reproductive, like the pubic symphysis. There's that bone right there. And here's the, what's that muscle called? Rectus abdominis. And what are these bones back here called? Which ones? Just wondering. Here's the rectum right here, a sigmoid colon, and then the rectum. And notice that there's an internal sphincter, external and internal right there. Remember, the internal is not under our control. External is. Meanwhile, that all has nothing to do with the reproductive system that I just talked about, except the pubic symphysis does, because it kind of loosens up in women in order to make more room to let the baby's head out. But here's the ovary, here's the tubes, uterine tube, also called the fallopian tube. This is the uterus. The wall of the uterus is in 3 layers: endometrium, perimetrium, and myometrium. We will talk about that in great detail. And then down here, this is the opening inside of the uterus. This is the cervix down here at this end. This little piece of vagina that goes back here behind the cervix is called the fornix. This is the vagina up here. Notice it stays pretty much collapsed all the time. This is the membrane, not the membrane, but the floor of the pelvis, which I'm sure I can think of the name of. One of these. What?
Kegels?
It's one you tighten up with your Kegels.
Urogenital diaphragm?
What? Urogenital diaphragm, thank you. And please notice that here's the bladder up front, bladder, urethra. There's some glands along it called the paraurethral glands, greater vestibular gland here. The vaginal wall has a number of glands in it, which we'll get to. On the outside, labia majora, labia minora, clitoris, and that's enough for that picture. You need to understand a little bit about the things that support the uterus, tubes, and vagina down there. Because one of the problems and one of the surgeries that I did a bunch of was basically pulling everything back up. And it usually would come in about age 40. Ladies would come in, they'd had 3 children early on in life, and by the time they get to 40, everything's just kind of fallen out. Think about a vagina that's about that big being stretched to about this big. It sort of tears everything down there apart. And yeah, in a lot of ladies it retightens up as the years go by, but believe me, a lot of them it doesn't. So then you have the uterus falling out, you have the vagina falling out, you have the colon, the rectum falling out through the vagina. Because all of the support down there was just kind of destroyed, not to be anyway, during childbirth. So
you're talking me into a C-section now.
Well, that's why in California, in some hospitals, the C-section rate runs as high as 85%. The ladies literally come in and tell the doctor, "You are going to do a C-section on me. I'm not going to have any of those problems. I want a C-section, period." And although insurance companies hate that because C-sections cost more money, they can always find some reason that they did it that way. So, you know, don't ever think that the controversy surrounding C-sections versus natural vaginal birth is all because of the doctors wanting to get out and go play golf. That is bull. The whole problem is with the women. The women want to have it this way. Well, my mother's in town and I want to have my baby on Monday. You want to have your baby on Monday? What?
Yes.
Well, she gets in on Sunday, and we don't want to miss her flight.
Yeah,
but we want her to
right.
have
So I mean, it's not a simple issue, and I think just think about that. We'll talk about it more when we get there. Anyway, the ovaries, uterine tubes are enclosed in this big, wide, broad ligament called the broad ligament. The uterine tubes run along the edge of it, and the mesoovarium is part of the mesentery that holds onto the ovary. So mesovarium means mesentery of the ovary. And here's a picture of these little lovely things. Here's the mesovarium right here, holding the ovary in place. This is called the infundibulopelvic ligament on the outside out here. This is the tube, the oviduct. This is the fimbriated end of the oviduct. Remember that the ovary gets a special blood supply. It gets it from what used to be called the gonadal artery and vein. And so here it is coming down here from the outside. Now that only provides blood for the ovary. It does not provide blood to the uterus and all the rest of this stuff. That all comes from just within the pelvis, mostly from the internal iliac vessels. So this is the broad ligament, this big broad thing out here. One of the things that we had to always watch for really carefully at surgery was these guys right here, because you see how close they live to the bottom end of the uterus. And when you're doing a hysterectomy, you basically are running a series of clamps up here and cutting and tying, and you don't want to catch one of the ureters in your clamp and cut it, because that would block off a kidney, and that would be a very bad deal. So we just always paid attention for them out here. This is the uterosacral ligaments. The uterosacrals do just what they say. They attach the uterus to the sacrum, keep it from moving front to back. I think I've said enough. This is kind of the way, if you could look at them under in cross-section through this way. Here's the uterine tube up here. Here's the ovary down here. This is the mesovarium, or the ovarian hilum. One thing that I always found weird when I started studying this stuff was these pictures of the ovary that look like this. Now, every one of these is an egg, okay? Every one of these. These are all drawn schematically, however. So, you know, these are a nest of eggs like this, an egg nest they call it, and then they start maturing, and each month one cell gets picked to be the honored one, and it starts to develop. It picks up a lot of follicular cells around it. It gets bigger and bigger until it looks like this, and that's called a mature follicle, also called a Graafian follicle. And then it finally, this matures more and more, and then finally one day this thing works its way right to the edge, and boop, it spits out this egg along with a whole bunch of cells around it, and that's called ovulation, when the ovary throws out the egg. And when it does that, then it starts to regress, and it becomes what's called a corpus luteum. Corpus luteum means whitish area, or maybe yellow. What is corpus? Luteum is yellow, I believe. The corpus luteum is important because the corpus luteum is what secretes all the progesterone, which is the hormone that keeps you pregnant. Okay, so assuming you got to that stage of the month, assuming you ovulated, assuming that egg met up with a sperm, and you are pregnant, then the corpus luteum is the one that produces the progesterone that will keep you pregnant and keep your body from getting rid of that egg, that fertilized egg, at that point. As the rest of the month goes by, it turns into a corpus albicans, which is a whitish little scar thing, and then it picks another one for the next month. We'll go through the entire monthly cycle with you very carefully. So just remember, these are not in order, although it always shows them in order. You know, from immature to maturing to maturing to maturing to ovulated to corpus luteum to corpus albicans. It's not really that way. But having removed, you know, dozens of ovaries, you get the ovary out in your hand and you cut it lengthwise, and you can see all of these things. These are bigger than you think. You can see the last, maybe the last one corpus luteum, and you can see the last 2 or 3 corpus albicans, which are the scars from the previous 2 months of ovulations. Oftentimes, if you were operating on the lady and it was right after the ovulation, and she had just spit this egg out, this whole area around here would be bloody. It would be bleeding because it's kind of a violent thing when it throws that egg out and tears through the tunica albuginea out here and creates some bleeding and so forth. And actually, that's why oftentimes we had to end up operating on the patients, because we couldn't figure out what was causing all their pain. Some ladies have a lot of pain with ovulation every month. Some don't ever. The ovaries are small little things. They're about that big or so, almond-sized. They do 3 main things. They produce these female gametes called oocytes. They are not fully matured by the time they're thrown out of the egg. Out of the ovary. That's important for you to know. And the secretion of hormones. We make a lot of hormones in our ovary. We make a lot of estrogens, and then the corpus luteums make a lot of progesterone, or progestin, which is the other main female hormone. There's also a secretion of inhibin, which is involved in feedback to the pituitary gland and slows down the FSH, which is follicle stimulating hormone, to slow down the process a bit. Ovarium, mesoovarium I mentioned, it just contains the artery and the vein, enough of that. The peritoneum, the ovary is an intraperitoneal thing, so it sticks out into the peritoneal cavity. It's completely covered with peritoneum, and that would be called the visceral peritoneum, right? But instead, since it's the ovary, we call it the germinal epithelium, same thing. I'd take either name. It just covers the surface of the ovary. It's not really very thick, and it overlies the tougher outer layer of the ovary called the tunica albuginea. Now, the tunica albuginea in a male on the outside of the testicle is incredibly tough, incredibly tough. In the female, it's not near so tough, but it's a bit tough. It's whitish, and there you go. The stroma is the cells on the inside of the ovary. There's kind of a cortex and medulla. Doesn't every organ have a cortex and medulla? It seems kind of silly. But anyway, just so you know, the gametes, the eggs are made out in the cortex on the outside. And remember, they have to work their way right to the edge in order to be ovulated and thrown out of the ovary when it's time for that to happen. Oogenesis is a lot of this chapter, and you need to understand the process. We studied it for the male, and how the male, it all happened in that seminiferous tubule, and the immature cells were on the outside, and they gradually worked their way up to the lumen, and then you had the mature spermatozoa up in the middle. Well, this sort of works the same way, except the timing is different. In men, the whole process is starting every half a second or so. Now, in this thing, the original production of ovums began long before birth. And I think they showed that in the movie. It said that ovum was created back when the baby was, like that big. All of the eggs that you're going to have in your whole life are created early during pregnancy. You keep making one egg mature every month until you reach menopause, which is the end of the reproductive life, usually about 49 or 50 years old, although with hormones that can be extended these days. So here's the process that you need to understand very well. Notice that mitosis of these oogoniums, these are the immature sex cells, happens before birth, and they're just it's just mitosis, right? 1 becomes 2, 1 becomes 2, 2 becomes 4, that sort of thing. But then some of them are picked up, and DNA replication happens before birth, and then you go into meiosis 1, also before birth. This is where you have synapses happen, and the 4 of them get together and they hug, and then they do that little exchange of DNA called crossing over. Yeah, and that all happens, and then everything just kind of moves into dormancy. And meiosis 1 actually isn't completed until after puberty. So not until age 13 or 14 or so does this stage start to happen. And this stage is where you go from a primary oocyte to a secondary oocyte. In other words, you go through meiosis 1. Okay? Meiosis 1 happens here, and we split, the cell splits into two halves, kind of, except it's not halves. Because remember, the female is working really hard on quality and not on quantity. And so she takes and puts all of the cytoplasm, all of the organelles, all the good stuff comes over here into this one thing. And the only thing that's in the other part, which we call the first polar body, is just thrown out. And it gets eaten up by the body and it goes away. So, it says here that the first polar body can split into two polar bodies. That doesn't really happen. And if it did, how would anybody know that? The fact is, you've got half of, this one has all of the cytoplasm for this pair. Then this one here, which is the only one that's really going to matter from here on down, goes into meiosis 2. Now the interesting thing about meiosis 2 is where you go from where the secondary oocyte is really created. That does not happen until you have fertilized the egg, until there is junction of the male and female cells. Then, as the egg is kind of tumbling down through the oviduct, we'll go through this again, but that's where meiosis 2 happens. It ovulates when it's in metaphase 2. That's when the egg is actually thrown out of the ovary. It doesn't give off that second polar body until it has already been fertilized by the sperm. And when it does, it throws out the second polar body, which gets rid of another bunch of DNA. And there is no DNA duplication like there is in mitosis. So it throws it out, and now we have an ovum, and the ovum is haploid. In other words, ovum only has, in humans, 23 chromosomes. Okay? And that's so that when the sperm joins it with his 23, they can get together and have 46, which is normal. Yes?
So let's say you have a little child born female, and then the child and the parents decide to have a sex change before puberty, and they start injecting testosterone, hormone treatment. If that happens before this meiosis 1, is that going to affect that child's egg production for the rest of their life, or if they ever wanted to reverse the process?
I would say simply I don't know the answer to that question.
Okay.
Sex change operations weren't done when I learned about this. Not to be funny, I just simply don't know the right answer, and I don't want to give you the wrong answer. But I can tell you, if you give anybody at any age enough hormones, you can screw up pretty much everything. So I would say, and you're probably exactly right. The fact that parents are making sex determinations before the age of puberty, that sounds kind of weird, doesn't it? Because the poor kid, what voice does the kid have in it, you know? They just really wanted a boy that bad?
Well, I think the child decides.
Yeah, a lot of times.
So you think the child is deciding?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You think a 11 or 12-year-old kid can make that decision?
Well, I think they know who they're attracted to.
Yeah, okay. I'm gonna pass on this one because I simply don't know the answer.
It's also
Moving along, let's go through the ovarian cycle. The ovarian cycle is the cycle that happens in the ovary. Now, I've been teaching this 232 class of mine, and I thought I've been teaching them the cardiac cycle really well. I mean, I try so hard to teach that just right. And you remember that slide we had that had the cardiac cycle, and up at the very top it had an EKG, and then it had the aortic pressure, and then it had the ventricular pressure, and then down at the bottom it had the volumes of the ventricle at the beginning diastolic and end diastolic, and that was the stroke volume in between those. You remember all that, right? I gave him this quiz the other day, and I said, what causes the dicrotic notch? And you probably remember that the aortic pressure in the ventricle goes up, and it comes down, and boom, it has a little blip in it. That little blip is called the dicrotic notch. And on this quiz, I said, what caused the dicrotic notch? And I got, well, that's caused by the firing of the SA node. That's caused by depolarization of the atria. That's caused by depolarization of the ventricle. That's caused by repolarization of the ventricle. Whoa, whoa, whoa. It's a pressure deal. This is not an electrical deal, right? So we got to keep the curves straight. And we're going to do a bunch of curves on the same graph here in a minute. So please keep it in mind. Don't get the EKG confused with the ventricular pressure or the aortic pressure or the aortic volume or whatever. Here we go. Ovarian cycle includes a monthly oogenesis. In other words, every month you're going to take one egg and you're going to put all this energy into it and you cause it to mature, and you're going to do that every month between puberty. First menstrual period is called menarche, M-E-N-A-R-C-H-E-H-Y. I'll show it to you on the slide in a minute. And then menopause, which is, 55. So what is that? That's 12 a year for, say, 30 years, 40 years. 400. That's all the eggs you're going to ever make.
Yeah, but at each one selling for roughly $5,000 or more.
Oh, that's right.
You're dumping out cash, man.
Yeah, you're pouring out cash every time you have one of those periods.
And that's why we get so upset.
I never quite thought about it that way.
That is why we get so upset.
Field development, this happens during early development, like we talked about. The primary oocytes are made very early. They stop at meiosis 1. And then getting rid of a lot of them is called atresia, and it is the degeneration of these primordial follicles. In other words, you start out with 2 million, we're really only going to use about 400 of them in the end, and the body starts getting rid of them. By puberty, the number is down to about 400,000, but even out of that 400,000, we're only going to use about 400 of them. So just keep that in mind. The primary oocytes remain suspended until puberty, and then at puberty, because of elevated rising FSH, follicle stimulating hormone. Where does that come from? Pituitary gland, right? What?
Oh, I just want to know, is there like a method to the degeneration of the primordial follicles? Is there like, the body says, oh, these ones...
These aren't so good?
Yeah.
And for what reason?
Yes, or is it just kind of like, oh, this one looks good.
I think a guy walks around with a checkbook and I don't know. They just, a bunch of them start croaking.
Okay.
Yeah, good question. Some primary, every month after, some of them start to develop further, and every time it's got to make 2 divisions, two splits in meiosis, remember, and each of those 2 splits, it splits completely unevenly. In other words, all of the cytoplasm goes with one of them, and the other one gets nothing. And then we call that just a polar body, and it dies, goes away. To make all the numbers come out right, they always say that the first polar body splits again, but like I say, I don't think that really happens. The ovary releases a secondary oocyte. In other words, that is the stage at which you ovulate. It is not a mature ovum. It is not ready to be fertilized. It is not even haploid at that point. It is just a secondary oocyte. And that will be a question somewhere. At what stage is the egg when it gets ovulated? And the answer is secondary oocyte. So anyway, it stays suspended there in meiosis 2, in metaphase of meiosis 2, until it picks up a spermie, and it gets fertilized, and when it does that, then that signals to the egg, hey, you need to finish up meiosis to get rid of the other half of the DNA so that you're now haploid, and then you've got the other haploid that's already in there from the male, from the sperm, and then it works its way towards the first, what's called the first division, first cell division. Because this fertilized egg, which has 46 chromosomes, has got to meld together the DNA from mama and the DNA from daddy. It's got to all line up in the middle, do the meiosis, the metaphase, do-si-do kind of thing, and split for the first time. And that first split is pretty darn important because that one cell is going to form two, and then that two cells is going to become four. But at no other time in the life cycle do you have a cell that has two conglomerations of DNA in it. One over here in this corner from daddy, one over here in this corner from mommy, and they've got to get together, do the independent assortment thing in the middle, and then start splitting. Okay? Ovarian follicles are these maturing follicles that is where the oocytes grow, where the meiosis I occurs. The primary oocytes are the ones that are going to be the one picked for that month. Always are going to live out near the tunica albuginea. They mature out of little clusters called egg nests. The primordial follicle, I'll show you a picture of one in just a minute, but believe me when I say that it's just a matter of it getting big enough, getting enough primordial, enough cells around it, follicular cells, then it develops an empty spot in the middle, and the oocyte and follicle cells are over on one side. And I've got lots of pictures, but I'll come back to it. So, each month, a bunch of these guys get activated. They think they're going to be the selected one, chosen one, but it doesn't happen but to one of them each time. The ovarian cycle is divided into two parts, and basically, if we so dare to put numbers of the month up here, 1, 15, and 28, which is a 28-day cycle. And that's an average number. Some people have cycles that are 27, some have them that are 30, and so forth. But this first half of the ovarian cycle is called something really important, like the follicular phase. And that's where the follicle is being prepared. More fluid is pouring into this follicle. More follicular cells are pouring into this follicle. And then the second